We're joined by Gavin Percy from Eventwell. Eventwell is an events industry charity which specialises in helping and supporting on education and well-being for the industry. And Gavin, you can tell us what you're going to talk to us about, and let me hand over to you. This is about back to live and back to the office.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen. That's probably the easiest thing to do, and then get started. So give me 1 second. There we go, from beginning. So hopefully you can all see the screen. So I've done a paper that I've called Reentry Shock. So this is part of that paper. And I really feel that that's something that's being underestimated generally. I know it's being talked about, but I think the shock of going back to work and going back into the workplace is something that's being underestimated to some extent. And in fact, I've just got the wrong screen up, so give me 1 second. Sorry, I've got 2 presentations today and I brought the wrong one up, so that's a good start. It's that one there that I want.
Yeah, no pressure, Gavin.
Yeah. So can you see that one now?
Not yet.
No. Okay. Let me. I'm doing really well here because for some reason I can't get rid of it. There we go.
Now I know what you're talking about, but it was very interesting yesterday when going to the event. There was a bit of, from my point of view, a bit of intrepidation of getting on the train, going up. It's only the second time that I'd been up to town in over a year. Yeah, it's interesting when you first start to interact with people in a live environment.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing here is to remember this is. I've got this partly around the sort of the corporate side of things and what companies need to do, but actually it's not just companies that have got responsibility here. The individuals have got responsibility. You've got responsibility to yourself. You've got responsibility for teams within your workplace. You've also got responsibility to think about your supply chain and also potentially for your delegates. So there's a whole list of people that are affected potentially by this reentry shock. Like you said about going to your live event last night, it's a bit of a shock to the system to actually get on a train and actually go somewhere and do something and meet people. And you've also got that trepidation about, can you shake hands or can you hug or can you not? And different people have different opinions about that, as whether you can or you can't. And you don't know what they're thinking. You might be quite comfortable with that, but they may not be, and vice versa. So it's all, you kind of got to go to the lowest common denominator, really. So just give you a quick bit about my background before we get started. So my background is basically all hospitality. I was a hotel general manager for many years, then went into sales, became a sales director for a couple of national hotel chains, Best Western and Swallow Hotels. Then I went to Principal Haley as head of central services, was with them for 4 years or so, and then got made redundant from there in 2013 and decided to start my own business. So my own business is called Winning Edges Consultancy, and I started off doing consultancy work. Mostly in the sales side, and very quickly that became sales training and customer service training. And whilst I was doing that, my wife went on mental health first aid training course and came back and told me that I should be doing that. So obviously I do what my wife tells me, and I went off and did that course. And I became a mental health first aid trainer. And I decided to split the company in two. So I've got a company called Balancing Edges, which is what does the mental health side of things. And I'm a partner of Eventwell, which is why I'm representing Eventwell today. But my company is called Balancing Edges, and I still have Winning Edges, which is my sort of sales consultancy side. But about 80% of my business now is on mental health, because I've got very interested in it. And I'm very keen to sort of lower the stigma and discrimination that surrounds mental health. And what this reentry shock is all about is trying to demystify this situation of that we've got ourselves into after COVID, where we're trying to get back to normal. But let's be real, the normal doesn't exist anymore that used to be. It's a new normal, and we don't quite know what that new normal is yet. And we're going to find it and find it as we go through things. So let me crack on anyway. So there was some research done quite early on within the COVID situation last year, and this was done by Zurich, I think it was. And it basically said employers will need to manage the psychological effects of the lockdowns on their workforce as they return to the office or factory or the workplace in general. And through low morale, hyper stress, and general fear, really. And the same study also found out that 37%, and this was early on in the first lockdown, 37% showed signs of psychological distress, 45% felt adverse effects on their mental health, and 70% felt this is the most stressful part of their career. And I suspect those figures will have gone up because that was in the early days of the COVID pandemic. And then who's affected by this re-entry shock? I think basically everybody is. I already mentioned that I think people like your staff, yourself, your teams, your supply chain, your delegates are all being affected by this. But in terms of the workplace specifically, the people who are returned to work after furlough, they've got issues that they need to resolve. You know, they're envious of those that were not furloughed. Can they still do the job? What's changed? The uncertainty of their security. Do they still want to do the job? You know, they've been doing lots of other things whilst furlough has been going on. Then you've got those that are returning to the office after home working, and it's, oh no, not the office, because we got used to working from home in our slippers and our shorts and t-shirts and so on. It's a poorer life-work balance. And then they're back to the commute, they're fearful what have changed, all those kind of things. And then there's those that have worked through, and they're envious of those that were furloughed. So we got my clicking fingers got a bit too happy there. Sorry about that. So those that have worked through, they'll be tired. They've been doing twice the amount of work everybody else was doing and what they were doing before. And then we've got the newly employed. Well, there's always stress around new jobs anyway. And that's probably just going to be magnified by the fact that that COVID's been going on and what are the protocols in the workplace. So I've put together sort of 5 points that I think need to be looked at. So the first thing is companies, this is from the company perspective, they need to provide return to work protocols and ongoing support. So that's things like risk assessments, health and safety guidelines, perhaps a testing regime, a worker travel policy so that the travelers know what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do and what the recommendations are in terms of how they travel, if there is travel involved in the workplace. Have a mental health and wellbeing strategy in place. And I've got a link to help you with that at the end as to where to find a template for that. Maybe put an employee assistance program in place if you haven't already got one. Look at mental health first aid, awareness training. Obviously, I would say that, wouldn't I? That's where I earn my money. And then well-being support, such as diet, exercise tips, those kind of things. And then look at maybe increasing the flexibility in the workplace. And I think most companies are looking at that and doing flexi time and flexi working and a sort of hybrid approach. And then we've got the promote bit. And this is really all about communication. So there's 3 important things here: communication, communication, communication. It's about impact, showing your employees the positive impact of work on their mental health. So informing the teams what you've done in changing the protocols, why you've done it, and what their responsibilities are. Make sure there's no surprises. And this information will make them feel more comfortable and less anxious, but also make sure that the mental health and wellbeing strategy is also communicated so they understand what their responsibilities are. And if there's mental health first aiders in the workplace, how to access that information, and also how to access the employee assistance program if there's one in place. So that communication is really important, and that carries on in this reduce the harmful impacts of work. Communication is also key here because good communication will reduce stress and anxiety. What are the forecasts for the business? How secure are people's roles? Ensure that working procedures and protocols are being effective. Using staff feedback as a way of measuring success. So make sure that you get their feedback to find out that you're doing the right things as far as they're concerned. Creating that culture of looking after mental health and well-being so that staff members feel they can open up. And then ensuring that staff members do have that life-work balance. I just notice to say life-work balance rather than work-life balance. It's a small point, but it's an important point. And then we've got implement. So that's implementing mental health and suicide prevention skills and awareness. Now, I would say this because that's what I do is do training, but I think it's really important that we create a culture around mental health and well-being in the workplace. And one of the ways I think that can be done is through training on mental health first aid. And I think 5 to 10% of the workforce should be mental health first aiders. 5 to 10% of the workplace should be mental health champions, which is a 1-day course. The first aid is a 2-day course face-to-face. And then the other 80 to 90% should be through the mental health awareness program. And that in itself will create this culture of reduce the stigma, discrimination around mental health, and make that culture one that the company can be proud of around mental health and well-being. And the last one is facilitate that early intervention and treatment. So by having that mental health culture in place, companies will encourage people to get the support they need before they're in crisis. I describe it as a bit of a spiral. We'll talk about that in a minute. We're in the spiral. So we're normally just hovering around somewhere at the top of the spiral, maybe dipping down occasionally for a day or an hour or a week, dipping down the spiral. But actually what happens if you dip down that spiral, you get negative about things. That negativity encourages more negativity. And before you know it, you disappear down into the vortex. So trying to get people out of the spiral in advance of that. And we should be aware of a Deloitte report that showed that for every £1 businesses invest in looking after employee mental health, they get a £5 return. And that's through lower absenteeism, increased productivity, reduced presenteeism, a higher morale in the workplace, reduced staff turnover, and better physical health. So all those things will contribute to that return on investment. And having that EAP, that employee assistance program in place, can help people get the immediate support that they need before the NHS can actually kick in, because the NHS at the moment, there are extended waiting lists, as we're all aware, and that is also in the mental health side of things as well. Things like talking therapies, at the moment there's up to a 6-month waiting list for a talking therapy through the NHS. An employee assistance program will give you immediate support on that side. So there's the sort of 5 things that I think are really important. And I would also urge you to look at the EventWell Manifesto, which I've put a link in there for. The EventWell Manifesto covers a lot of these things and a few more things beside. And it's something that the EventWell organization is trying to get companies to sign up to show that they're looking after their staff's well-being and mental health. And I found this quote this morning, so I've just quite hurriedly stuck it in here, so I'm sorry it doesn't quite match my color schemes, but there you go. So this is by another Priya, not our Priya, a different Priya Parker, who does a podcast with Brené Brown, who's quite well known in the mental health and well-being side of things. And I thought this quote was worth just mentioning. So gathering again, including returning to work, is going to be complicated and possibly uncomfortable. Naming the elephant in the room is the most powerful tool we have. We need to make the implicit explicit, even if the elephant is just awkwardness. Naming what's happening and making it explicit allows everybody to take a breath. And I thought that was really important. And that's really around this communication piece.
Gavin, if I can jump in there with a quick comment and observation for everybody before I forget it, because it kind of aligns very much to that and some of the stuff you were just talking about. As I said, I was at this Mice Book event last night, which was great fun. And it was good to be around. And I won't say who these people are, but I was talking to a number of hoteliers that were there. And one of the problems that they've got is finding staff now. You know, they had to lay a lot of people off. They've had to make a lot of people furlough. A lot of people then re-geared and have gone somewhere else. Yeah. And even one of the hotel groups saying, you know, we're busy now because people on the consumer side are booking breaks and booking UK holidays, but we're only going to run the hotels at 50% occupancy because we can't get the staff at the moment. So that's a big pressure point for us, and we can't overstretch our people. Yep, so absolutely. I think on that, it's just an observation which I hadn't even thought about personally. Yeah, it's a big problem, and I think Brexit's had something to do with that as well, because a lot of the foreign staff have gone home. So yeah, that's another issue. But I think as corporate event managers and planners, when we're going back to live, we also need to be conscious of that one from a question point of view, but also understanding that hotels could be stretched. So sorry. Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And I think, yeah, you'll see on LinkedIn, there's adverts from every hotel group looking for staff. So yeah, if you want a little bit extra cash, you know where to go.
So that I thought was quite a good quote, and the elephant in the room is something that I talk about on some of my training, because I went on a presentation by Marks and Spencers, and they actually have sort of titled their mental health policy around the elephant in the room, and they started it off with an inflatable elephant in their staff canteen at head office, asking people to put a post-it pad on the inflatable elephant to say what they thought about mental health in the workplace, and that opened a whole lot of discussion and debate. So that elephant in the room is their theme. So I thought it was quite fitting to go with what I talk about on that side. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about the mental health continuum. So I think we would all agree this is about ourselves or about our staff or about anybody we know will sit somewhere on this scale between maximum mental well-being and minimum mental health well-being, and that could change hourly, daily, weekly. We can be moving up and down this graph any particular day. Now, what we've done over the last since the start of this century is we've actually put another axis in, and that axis is no diagnosis to a diagnosis, and that's created 4 quadrants. So the top right-hand quadrant is where you've got good mental health, but you have no diagnosis, and that's clearly where we'd all like to be. We'd all like to be in that quadrant. But there are times, and I'm sure we'll all admit, there are times when we fall below the line. And when we fall below the line, we're in quadrant 2, this bottom right-hand corner, and quadrant 2 is where we have poor mental health, and that could be on a scale from not too bad to bloody awful, but we have no diagnosis. And again, we could be below the line for an hour, a day, a week, month, or for several months, depending on our situation. And then we have quadrant 3, which is the one bottom left, and that's where we have a diagnosis, but we still have poor mental health. So that's where we've taken some support, we've gone to see the GP, or we've gone to see some talking therapy, or we've used the EAP, but somehow along the line we've managed to get a diagnosis of something that's a situation we're in, but we're not yet in recovery. We've still got poor mental health. And then the last quadrant, top right, top left-hand corner, is where we have recovery, but we have a diagnosis, but we have good mental health. So the diagnosis is there, but we've taken treatment, we've maybe had some talking therapies, we've maybe had some tablets, maybe had a bit of both, and we're actually able to live the situation we've got. So we're in recovery, and that's quadrant 4. But we can still dip below the line from time to time. While we're in recovery, you could stop taking your drugs, there could be a crisis happens in your life, there could be a bereavement, anything like that could then dip you below the line. And people who've got ongoing mental health issues, it may be that something triggers that and puts them below the line again. But most people who have a diagnosis, most people who are in a situation where they're in recovery will know what to do to get them back in recovery again. They'll know the things that work for them. Okay, but that's the 4 quadrants, and I just quickly want to put that up to show you what I've just said, really. But that's quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. We can move around the quadrants, we can jump around, but we will have to go in a clockwise direction from quadrant 1 through to quadrant 4. You can't jump from 1 to 3, you can't jump from 2 to 4. You have to go through quadrant 2 to get to quadrant 3. If you're taking support quickly, you might only be in quadrant 2 for a short time, because you go and see your GP very quickly, he gives you a diagnosis, he gives you some treatment, and you move into quadrant 3, and in quadrant 3 you might only be there for a short time because the treatment works really quickly, and you might be in quadrant 4, but you have to go through quadrant 3 to get to quadrant 4. Okay, so that's where we're all in this quadrant somewhere, we're all in this continuum somewhere, and you might want to think about, where are you right now? Where have you been? Where are you at the moment? Where are your teams at the moment? And that sort of exercise is quite a useful exercise to think about, and think about where you are. And if you're in quadrant 2, which is, in my opinion, the worst of the 4 quadrants, because you haven't got access to any treatment yet. If you're in quadrant 2, or you're someone you think's in quadrant 2, you need to try and get them to get some support to move them into quadrant 3, or to find ways of getting them back into quadrant 1 again. And we're going to talk about some of the treatments that might help for that.
Gavin, can you also touch on how you can address that? So if you think that someone is stressed, the natural thing is, we all have that conversation. We had it in the office, and it goes, "Hey, how are you today?" And it's like, tick the box. I've asked the question. Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. But perhaps they're not, and it's
Well, it's an automatic. I don't know if anyone watched the Roman Kemp documentary that was on recently. I would urge you to watch that if you haven't, because it was very well done. And he was saying, ask the question twice. So we all go, "You're right, yeah, you." don't we? Yeah, sort of automatic reaction. Yeah, we're fine, great, move on. And you've asked the question, you've got the answer, you're happy with that. But actually, you know that's probably not the right answer. So you need to say, no, really, seriously, how are you today? Yeah. And they go, well, you know, I've had a bit of this and a bit of that. I'm not really great. Now, in terms of what can you do about that, to be honest, there's a 2-day course on that, which I run. So it's not as simple as answering that question. And everyone is individual. Every case is individual, because we're all in that continuum somewhere. We're all somewhere different on that continuum. No two people are in the same place in that continuum. So it's very difficult to give you an answer to that in this short presentation. But there is a 2-day course, which is the mental health first aider, and there's the champion course, which gives you a little bit of an aid towards that. But I will be giving you some coping strategies shortly that I think will be useful and will start helping that journey, specifically to get people from quadrant 2 to quadrant 1. These coping strategies will be useful. So I am going to talk about that. So we'll get to that in a moment. But the thing that stops people getting the support they need, particularly moving from quadrant 2 to quadrant 3, is the stigma and discrimination around mental health. Because people just sit in quadrant 2 because they don't want to let people know that they're struggling. They don't want to show weakness. They don't want their boss to think that they might not be able to do the project they've been given. They don't want to think they might get sacked for not being capable of doing the job. So they just sit in quadrant 2 and they don't take the help. And that, unfortunately, is particularly men. I shouldn't be sexist about it, but men are generally poorer at getting support and help than women are. So men will sit in quadrant 2 and man up, to use that expression. Some women do as well, don't get me wrong, but a lot of men are in that quadrant 2, trying to just struggle through. But actually what we need to do is lower that stigma and discrimination around mental health to make sure people do get the support they need by moving into quadrant 3, and then only then can they move into quadrant 4 and get into recovery. And this is the spiral I was talking about earlier. These are just some examples of the sort of thing that can happen when you get into that spiral. Your thoughts get more and more negative as you go down that spiral. And before you know it, you're disappearing down that vortex. And as the last point there says, what's the point in living? That's the stage people can get to in that spiral. And that's obviously, we want to try and get people not to get to that stage in the spiral. So what we need to try and do is get them to get the support and help they need early on, before they get further down that spiral. It's much easier to catch them early on than it is late on. And we need to start looking for the signs about where they may be struggling. And I'll show you some of those shortly. So in the workplace, it could be things like lack of cooperation, it could be productivity problems, it could be loss of morale, erratic timekeeping, safety issues, all sorts of different things. Absenteeism and presenteeism. Now, presenteeism is a relatively new concept. And you think, well, that's great. He's at work or she's at work loads of hours. She's really trying, or he's really trying hard. But actually, are they being effective? And it's been proven by Deloitte that presenteeism is actually more expensive in the workplace than absenteeism is. People who are in the workplace but aren't being effective. So that's something that you need to look at in your workplace. Overworking, maybe conduct problems because they're taking more risks, or they don't care anymore, or whatever. Those are just some of the sort of examples that you might notice in the workplace. But the key thing is changes in behavior, where that person used to do something and doesn't do it anymore, or didn't do something before and is doing it now. And you think, well, that's odd. Why is the behavior change? You know, maybe the way that they look, they may be unkempt, or they may not be shaving when they used to shave, or may not put makeup on when they used to put makeup on, all those kind of things. Those changes in behavior may be a red flag to say they may be struggling. And as I mentioned earlier, Deloitte did this report last year, 2019, saying the cost of poor mental health in the UK for employers is up 16% since 2016. It's now £45 billion a year it costs businesses. And that is things like presenteeism, absenteeism. It's things like staff turnover, having to replace staff that leave because of poor mental health, and so on. All these factors together add up to £45 billion a year. And then for every £1 spent, I've already mentioned the stat, the Deloitte say that employers will get an average of £5 back for every pound they spend on mental health and well-being. So there were 602,000 cases of work-related stress, depression, or anxiety in 2018-19 in the UK. And in the same period, stress, depression, or anxiety were responsible for 44% of all cases of work-related ill health and 54% of all working days lost. Now, you might think, why is those percentages different? Well, the reason for that is that mental health tends to be a longer lasting illness. So people will take longer time off sick. So 44% of work-related ill health, but 54% of the working days lost because the length of time they're off sick is longer. Now, let's be fair, we all know that not every work-related illness that's been reported is for backaches and flu and so on, is for backache and flu. A lot of those things will actually be for stress, anxiety, or depression. So let's be realistic, those figures are probably underreported significantly. And then 77% of employees have experienced symptoms of poor mental health in their lives. 48% of employees have experienced a mental health problem in their current role. And 62% attributed their symptoms to work or said work was a contributing factor. And that's before COVID. And I want to talk now about the stress container, because the stress container is really where we can help people fairly dramatically. Okay. So we all have a stress container, okay, or a stress bucket. And our stress buckets change in size depending on how resilient we are. Some people have huge, big stress containers. You can give them loads and loads of projects. They don't get stressed about it. They carry on, blah, blah, blah. But eventually, at some point in time, their stress container will overflow. But we all know people who've got tiny little stress containers, and you give them one new project and they completely go off the deep end. Yeah. So everyone's stress container is a different size, and that is dependent upon your vulnerability or your level of resilience. And when the bucket overflows, problems will develop. So we result in what's called emotional snapping, or it can be called a stress signature. Okay. So my stress signature is I literally do snap. I start barking at people. I bark at the dog, he barks back. I bark at my wife, I bark at the kids, da 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 da. Yeah, that's how I show my stress levels go. I do that. Other people might cry. Other people might go under the duvet. Other people might withdraw. Different people do different things. But you'll know probably what your stress signature is, and you'll probably know what your partner's stress signature is, and you probably know what a lot of your friends' stress signatures are. Do you know what your work colleague's stress signature is? And what we need to try and do is we need to try and get to the stage where your stress container doesn't overflow. So how do we do that? Well, we do that through something called coping strategies. And that's what you were talking about earlier, Richard. What sort of techniques can you use? And that's called good coping strategies. And that lets the stress out. Now, I'll give you some examples of some of my stress coping strategies. So my main one is walking that dog that I just talked about. Okay, so I walk the dog. He's a working cocker. He likes a good walk. I'm a bit overweight. I could do with more walking. And it gives me fresh air. It gives me exercise. It lets me get my head straight. Okay, so that's my main one. But I've got lots of other ones. I've got apps that I use for meditation. I've got breathing apps that I use. I like reading. I like doing a bit of gaming. Things like that will relieve my stress. But then we've also got the situation where there's poor coping strategies. Okay, so these poor coping strategies, all they do is put stress back in the container. Now, unfortunately, in my case, that usually involves a bottle of red wine. Okay, so it usually involves alcohol, drugs. It can be gambling. It can be gaming. I mentioned gaming as a release strategy, but it can also be a poor coping strategy as well, because excess gaming can actually cause you more stress. So what happens here is, for example, if you do have that bottle of red wine I was talking about, the next morning you might feel a bit fuzzy. You go to work, you're not being very effective at work, you get less work done. That adds more to your stress. It can also, let's be realistic here, we know that alcohol is a depressant. So actually taking more alcohol can cause you more stress because it gives you gives you depression. So all these things, we need to be careful to make sure that our coping strategies are coping strategies that will help and not hinder your development. And it's really important that we stop the bucket from overflowing. Whatever size your bucket is, we need to stop that bucket from overflowing. So we need to recognize the signs before we get to the stage of the emotional snapping or the stress signature. And that's these coping strategies. So recognizing when you're getting close to those things and using those coping strategies. Okay, sorry, someone's just put in the chat, just seeing what it was. So what I want you to do now as a wee exercise, have we got time? How are we doing for time? We've got about 15 minutes left, haven't we?
Yeah, I think we're fine.
Yeah, just quickly have a little think about what's in your stress buckets. Okay, so just draw a quick bucket on a bit of paper and just write in your stress bucket what's in there. Okay, and think about what's in there, and think about what support evidence do you have to support your feelings? What can you change? What can't you change? What needs your urgent attention, and who can help me? But then also think about what your coping strategies are. What's your helpful coping strategy, and what's your unhelpful coping strategies? Have a think about those things. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that. You can obviously carry it on after this call as well and do it in your own time. And I also suggest this is a very good exercise to do for your teams. So giving your teams this exercise to do and finding out what's in their stress container. They don't need to share it with you. You just say to them, what's in there that you can change? What's in there that you can't change? Because actually things that are in your stress container that you can't change shouldn't be in there because you can't control them. So I'll give you an example of that is traffic jams. If you're in a traffic jam, we all get stressed sometimes in traffic jams. And I'm not saying it's easy not to get stressed about them, but at the end of the day, you cannot change the fact you're in a traffic jam. So why get stressed about it? Put your things in place to try and minimize the problem. Call your colleague, call your customer, whoever you're going to be late for, to tell them you're going to be late. But at the end of the day, don't get stressed about it because you can't control it. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but there may be other things in your stress container that you can't control, in which case, why are you getting stressed about it? That in itself can relieve some of the stress.
And Gavin, just to jump in, we're not asking people to share this.
Not at all.
Just a little process to help you go think through.
Yeah.
What are my stress points? What are they? And what can I do and can't do? And you'll sort of help talk about the help process.
I find it quite cathartic to do it. And I would suggest if you do get into the habit of doing this once a week or once a month for yourself, or when you're feeling a bit stressed, maybe, and just clearing some of the crap out there that's in there, because some of the stuff that's in there doesn't actually do anything and it's not going to help. The other thing I would think about is things that are in your stress container. Think about what you can do quickly. Because the way I get motivated by being successful at things. So if I've got an action list of things to do and they're in my stress container, if I can tick a few things off, I feel better about myself. I get the more difficult things done. Now, that's not how everybody works. Some people might want to get the difficult things done first. So however you work, just look at your stress container and go, I'm going to get that big thing done first to get it out of the way. Some people think that way. My way is I do the easy things first to get myself motivated to do the more difficult things. Whatever way is your way of working, you should try and do. So try and get those things out of your stress bucket before your stress bucket overflows. So I've given you a couple of minutes while I was talking there just to note a few things down. But as I say, you can do this after the presentation. And I would suggest you try and do this for yourself weekly, monthly, whatever, but also try and get your teams to do it for themselves on a regular basis as well. And see if that's something you can help, and think about those unhelpful coping strategies and try and stop doing those and try and do more of your helpful coping strategies. And we'll talk about
that. Right, this is a coping strategy, because it's say, right, let's have some post-its or whatever we want to do and say, right, these are my stress points. What am I doing about them? Don't ignore them and carry on stressing about them. I
definitely think doing the stress container is in itself a coping strategy. Yeah. Definitely. But there's other things you can do, and everyone's different. I've mentioned about me walking the dog as my main one. Well, my wife keeps a journal. That's what she does. She thinks that's great. To me, that would add to my stress container. I would think, Jesus Christ, I've got to fill that bloody book out now. And I don't want to do that. So actually, for me, that would add to stress. But for her, it works. So everyone's different. What coping strategies work for different people will work for different people. And you might need to try a few things before you find out what works for you. But it could be as simple as knitting, or having a hot bath with some candles, or doing a breathing exercise, or listening to a meditation app, or just sitting listening to music that you haven't listened to for ages, or going back to a hobby you used to have that you've not been able to do because of the kids' work stresses and everything else. Try and do something you used to enjoy doing. Whatever it might be, find those coping strategies and utilize them to relieve that stress from yourself before you overflow, before you get to the stage of your stress overflowing. Let's be fair, stress is normal. Stress is it helps us to survive. Being stressed helps us to survive. If we didn't have stress, we wouldn't want to cross the road. We wouldn't be able to cross the road safely because we wouldn't be stressed about the traffic. So stress is required.
I also used to feel that a certain level of stress to me was positive. It's like adrenaline. I loved being under pressure. It's didn't want to get to the point where it's like, I can't cope, but I thrived on some of that pressure.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think stress and different people thrive on different things. If your stress container is bigger, you're more likely to be thriving on that stress. But some people just don't. People who don't who can't take that. You know, people you go drip feed information to and drip feed tasks to because they can't take the stress. You'll know people like that. So you need to judge how you're doing things for different people. But the sort of signs to look for in here are things like feeling anxious, people feeling anxious or worried, feeling depressed or unhappy, emotional outbursts, all those things that are on there. These are the sort of things you might see in terms of the changes in behavior that I was mentioning earlier, and to look for those in the workplace and try and address those. If there's a mental health first aider in the workplace, get them to maybe speak to the person. If you've not got mental health first aider in place, then have a look at the Mental Health First Aid England website and look at the Take 10 Together resource that's in there. Take 10 Together is just taking 10 minutes with somebody, have a chat with them about their mental health. And there's some resources in the MHFA England website about that. So those are the sort of things you can do to help them on that. And these are the sort of key points for well-being for yourself, for your staff, for your teams, for your customers, for your delegates. You know, eat well, drink water, not drink well. If you drink well, it's usually red wine again. Drinking water, so 2 to 3 liters of water a day is the recommended minimum. Exercise regularly, and actually it's been proven that a half-hour strenuous exercise a day will be as effective for your mental health as an antidepressant tablet. So 30 minutes strenuous exercise, what it does is it creates serotonins in the brain, and all that antidepressant tablet will do is put false serotonins in the brain. So actually that half-hour strenuous exercise, and that will vary from person to person as what that is. For one person, that could be a 10K run. For somebody else, it could be walking around the block. It doesn't matter. However healthy you are, strenuous exercise is defined as puts a bit of a sweat on.
Like I say, you got to put some effort into it.
Yeah. Get a bit of a sweat on, but that could be a stiff walk, or it could be a 10K run. Yeah. Invest in those routines. Get your routines going. Sorry, I was trying to move my pictures again. Those sleep routines going, and be grateful, be kind, be in tune. And that I'm going to show you something about that in a moment. In terms of nature, I recognize bigger successes from lesser wins. So that's what I'm saying about ticking off those easy things first before you do your bigger things, and control what you can control. Accept what you can't control, like the traffic jam I spoke about. So last week was Mental Health Awareness Week, and it was about the environment and nature. And it said, the MHFA website said that 45% of us reported that being in green spaces have been vital for our mental health during the pandemic. We've had more time to do that. And this is where I live. And I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about Knaresborough. It's a little lovely town in North Yorkshire that I live. So before the pandemic, my wife and I would be busy people running around, going to work, coming back from work, going to events, coming back from events, etc., picking kids up, blah, blah, blah. And if we had to get something from town, we'd just drive into town, get it, drive back again. And really, we just took it for granted. But during the pandemic, what we've done is we've got into the habit of walking into town with the dog, getting whatever we need to get in town, buying a coffee, and sitting and watching the view. So maybe going to this cafe, which is called Marigolds on the river, or buying a coffee up at the castle here and looking at the view from up there, and just admiring it and saying, aren't we lucky where we live?
Yeah. And
appreciating it. And that is really the important thing, is to get into the zone that you appreciate what you've got. So the last point here is to have a look at the EventWell website. There's a little quiz in there called Every Mind Matters. And if you click on that link, when you get this presentation through, you can click on the link. It'll take you through to Every Mind Matters. And it's 5 questions. And it gives you what's called a mind plan. So it just looks at what's in your stress container, basically, and says, here are the 5 things, the things you might think about doing that might make you feel better. So there's some great tips in there. I did it myself, and I thought the responses were actually pretty accurate for what I need myself. What I've also put in the presentation, I put some links. I mentioned earlier about workplace protocols and the workplace policy guides. So there's 2 or 3 links at the top there. ACAS, St. John's Ambulance, and MHFA England all have some resource that you could look at. EventWell itself, there's a great resources in there for mindfulness, bibliotherapy, basically reading books, and general well-being, and that website ggets updated regularly with lots of new resources. I'd urge you to have a look at that. The Every Mind Matters, we've already mentioned. The Mind Info line, if you're struggling yourself personally or someone you know is struggling. and there's also Rethink and the Samaritans. So there's a number of different resources you can look at, and I've put those links in here for you. And I've also put my contact information in there. If people want to get in touch with me about anything in particular, I'm very happy to take calls or speak to people on email or whatever about how we might be able to move things forward for your business. So if there's any questions, I'm very happy to take questions from anybody in particular, and I'm very happy to take them online or offline. So if anyone wants to make some questions, that'd be great.
Thanks, Gavin. That's really interesting and useful, and I know it's very, very top line, very quick. I know that we, as EMA, we're going to be working with you guys at Event Well, and I think we're going to be offering some courses to people with a discount. So if they want to still go deeper dive into this, or have some of their team members do it, I think it's just great. People need to be more aware. I've known Helen for years. It's just so important. I think our industry, our sector, and again, I know when I was running my agency, I was that bad boss, who was, come on, man up, let's get on with this, let's do this. And I think I've even said that I ended up putting one of my best team members in hospital in France '98 World Cup because we were, partying at night and up early in the morning, working, stress. And yeah.
Well, it's a very, the figures on events, by the way, are significantly worse than figures for the general population. I'd mentioned earlier about the numbers in the population. It's actually 1 in 4 people have a mental health illness every year. Well, in the events industry, it's 1 in 3. Because the events industry is so much more stressful than other industries. Because of that factor, you work hard, play hard, it's the tradition of the industry. Yeah. We get stressed about customers. We're dealing with customers, we're dealing with suppliers, we're dealing with venues, and we're getting it from all sides as well. So you've not just got one person to deal with. We're in the middle dealing with everybody, and taking all that stress and strain. And there's obviously big deadlines to meet as well. So there's a lot of stresses and strains in our industry in particular.
Yeah, it's one of those things because you've got a deadline to hit from a production, an event, or going live, and it's not like, oh, okay, I'll get that finished tomorrow. It's happening. It's got to be done.
And also the changes that have happened because of COVID, hybrid events, we're learning that as a new way of doing things. We're having to deal with new suppliers we haven't dealt with before. We don't know if they're any good or not any good. All these things are adding to our stress as well. So I think that's fairly significant too.
Yeah, the spotlight's on the individual. One of the things I was interested in, as well, just sort of as a quick last final question, is that we talk about people being under pressure and where that stress is coming from. There's just so many different points it can come from. And it's not just work, but of course it's work that gets affected, as in, you could be having relationship problems, you could be having financial problems, you could have, an aged parent or auntie that's very ill, and so those pressure points that are outside the role of responsibility of the company that you work for, but it's the company that you work for, the team that you work with, that can get affected by these because of stress. And I think that again is that sort of, what do you have in your crisscross? You have the people not wanting to engage with that because it's affecting their work, but it's not their work's problem.
And often that can manifest itself in presenteeism, because particularly relationship issues, because they don't want to go home because they've got a relationship issue, and so they stay at work, but actually they're not being effective. Yeah. But the mental health first aiders, it doesn't matter what the source of the problem is. You deal with the symptoms that are in front of you. So that whether that stress is caused by work or it's caused by a personal issue or even a socioeconomic issue. COVID is not anyone's fault, but it's something that's affecting people's mental health. So whatever is causing it, it doesn't actually matter to a mental health first aider. They deal with the symptoms and they will give support to people as they need it, for whatever reason that is. And if it in some cases it doesn't affect people's work, but they're still showing some symptoms, but their work is still good. It doesn't matter. If they're showing symptoms, then we need to deal with those symptoms.
Yeah, I agree. It's I think it's just really good that this has come more. There's more openness about mental well-being now. It's still a long way to go. Yeah, but we're seeing it now, and I think that's the learning for all of us can be if you feel down or out, talk about it, talk to somebody about it, address it. If you can see that somebody is feeling down or stressed, talk to them about it, try to help. And perhaps that's, the next part of that. If you're not quite sure how to help, then go on one of these courses. And
yeah, I think you're right. Or get somebody in your business to go. If you've got a business with teams of people, there'll be somebody there who's got an interest in this area who may be the right person to go in that course rather than you yourself. Yeah. Doesn't matter, but you need somebody in the business. In my view, as I say, 5 to 10% should be mental health first aiders, and 5 to 10% should be mental health champions, because that support in the workplace is really, really important. But I understand some companies, don't feel that's necessary or don't want to do it. That's entirely up to the company. Yeah. But I think that it shows you what Deloitte said in their report, that it's not a cost, it's a return on investment. So it's something I would urge people to look at.
Okay. Gavin, I'm going to wrap up now. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for that, so much for your time, and the great work that you and the EventWell team are doing, particularly for our industry and everything else. Guys, I hope everybody found that useful. We'll be circulating the notes, and we have videoed it, so we'll be putting that out there, and we can put Priya will be putting more information on the website and contact details for anyone who wants to follow up. Thanks everyone. Have a great weekend. Thank you.